We will start now.
Sure.
Welcome, friends. Welcome to Manchi Pustakam once again. Today we are having, though it is part of history, but the topic itself is more interesting in the given times when we are living in. Half-long says we are living in interesting times.
Sure.
We are living in interesting times.
Welcome, friends. Welcome to Manchi Pustakam once again. Today we are having, though it is
Here. I'm just muting the other instruments so that they don't get disturbed. So we're living in very interesting times. Writing history will become more interesting and challenging when we are living in interesting times. I came across Professor Upender's book through a review. Then immediately I ordered. I was fascinated by her introduction. While introducing, is a part of the new kind of curriculum she is developing for the campus she is working in. Let me introduce Professor Upender. Upinder Singh is a professor of history, Ashoka University, and she has been assigned with the task of preparing a new series of syllabus for ancient India, medieval India, and modern India, I believe. I'll request, except Upender Singh, professor, the main presenter, I'll request all others to mute themselves so that it won't affect the quality of the event. So Sudarshan Garu, please mute. Yeah. That's how I came across this book, and also immediately I contacted Professor Upender ji. She's kind enough to accept our invitation. You know the value of the history in the given context, and to understand comprehensively about history and how it has been shaped or being reshaped, it's important to go to the original sources. And I believe this will be of great help in going back to the original sources to assess and understand what exactly was our history and how we are being taught now about the history. So she interestingly writes about some text, how they shaped over the period. Yeah, we have certain canons, and mythological, historical, or semi-historical, hagiographical canons, and they are usually, if we are talking about this book, we can identify the date of publication and the author and the theme immediately. But in our canons, we don't know who wrote what part of the canon. So that is the big challenging task for the historian. In that context, I thought it would be useful to have a discussion on this book by so that our people will be more so that is the idea behind this. And though most of the participants are new about Manchi Pustakam, just for a brief introduction to Professor about ourselves, we are a group of young team that came together to start this venture. We started Manchi Pustakam as a WhatsApp group, and we circulated the Gutenberg's free downloadable books, some running into some lakhs. Then the people started asking us, why don't you have this kind of discussion, so that sharing the book is different and giving a brief introduction and kind of generating an interest, inculcating an interest to read the book will be more helpful. So then we started this YouTube venture in the last year's August. So far we could cross 110 videos. We introduced about 110 books. And the day before yesterday, we have we have organized a discussion on the last years of Karl Marx, written by Professor Marcelo Musto of Toronto University. And earlier we have Christoph Jefferlat as well on our channel. Now you are on the big league, I hope. And next week, we are going to organize a discussion on this book. And Tushar Gandhi will be presenting his views on this book, being the author. This title is Let Us Kill Gandhi. Because we also thought of re-engaging with the Gandhi or throughout this year. This is the fourth book we are organizing in this year, starting with January 30th. So with this brief introduction, I welcome Professor Upendraji to take the floor. Yeah.
Thank you very much, Viraya, for inviting me to this session where I can discuss my recent book, Ancient India Culture of Contradictions. I'm very happy to know about Manamanchi Pustakam and all the good work that you are doing in generating ideas and discussion with various authors. So thank you very much. The book I'm going to discuss today, Ancient India Culture of Contradictions, is different from everything else that I have written before. My historical approach has always been strongly empirical, and I have focused on specific themes. As was mentioned by Viraya a few minutes ago, the genesis of this book is when I had to teach a course on Indian civilizations to undergraduates in Ashoka University to try to convey some important issues to them without drowning them in a mass of details. In order to make the course meaningful to my students, I decided to organize it around certain contradictions in ancient Indian culture, contradictions that can be seen even today. This book is an elaboration of what I tried to do in that course. These days, there's a great deal of popular and political interest in ancient India. It is more urgent than ever before to move discussions of history out of the universities and academic journals into the wider world. For far too long, most Indian historians have chosen to magisterially speak from the pulpit, usually to other historians, rarely to ordinary people. The enormous misconceptions and misinformation circulating at the popular level about history are a reflection of historians' refusal or inability to communicate with a larger audience. So I really feel that the initiative that has been launched by Manamanchi Pustakam is very important in this context. The feelings of belonging and alienation that history can arouse makes it highly susceptible to manipulation. This makes it all the more necessary to explain history and historical method to non-historians. This is especially so given the overt politicization of history these days. In this book, I have tried to explain the complexities and textures of primary sources, texts, material evidence, etc., to interested lay readers. I have tried to explain that no ancient text is a simple reflection of the realities of its time. It is a complex representation of those realities, and historical analysis involves rigorous analysis and arguments. It is difficult to do justice to a theme as vast and complex as ancient Indian culture. I chose a few themes that are central to understanding ancient Indian history, culture, and thought by focusing on the coexistence of certain radical tensions and oppositions between social inequality and salvation, desire and detachment, goddess worship and misogyny, violence and nonviolence, and debate and conflict. The past can be beautiful, uplifting, and inspiring. It can also be ugly, unsettling, and disturbing. My book invites readers to abandon simplistic stereotypes and to try to grasp some of its complexities instead of sitting in judgment. Interestingly, the powerful contradictions discussed in this book are not part of a dead, fossilized past. Although a great deal has changed over the centuries, we can see these contradictions around us even today. To engage the general reader, in this book, I have book-ended my discussion of ancient India with references to contemporary times. But I would like to emphasize that ancient Indian history has to be understood on its own terms and not distorted to suit diverse political agendas. I will not summarize my book today, but I will focus on how writing this book made me think through certain issues and how I tried to take my readers along with me. My first chapter, Inequality and Salvation, that is the title, starts with the tragic death of Rohit Vemula, student of the University of Hyderabad, and the searing critique of caste discrimination that he left behind. It is important to recognize that the idea that all humans, men and women, are equal is a very recent idea in world history. Inequality has been part of all societies in all times of history, but its institutional forms and nature have varied. I have focused in this book on the early history of 4 bases of inequality in ancient India: slavery, varna, caste, and untouchability. The history of these institutions and practices and the experiences of subordinated and marginalized groups have to be reconstructed on the basis of sources that give a very partial, biased, and from the top view, representing the interests and ideas of upper classes and religious elites. I go on to explore the questioning of inequality, which mainly took place at the religious and soteriological level in Jainism, Buddhism, and the bhakti of Alvars and Nayanmar. The questioning of inequality at the religious level did not take the form of a clarion call for social equality, but an assertion of the potential of all to attain spiritual goals. These ideas led to the creation of new kinds of religious communities, such as the monastic and lay communities of the Jains and Buddhists, and those based on devotion to a supreme God, in the case of bhakti. Social inequality could not be abolished, but it was questioned, and one could opt out of it by giving up worldly life or focusing on higher religious or spiritual aspirations. When we think of inequality in ancient India or in any time and place, there are many questions that need to be asked. How were the forms of inequality perpetuated? Was there docile acquiescence, acceptance, or was there resistance and revolt? The guardians and enforcers of inequality included rulers, upper classes, and upper castes. Social and political ideologies made inequality seem natural and unquestionable and helped to maintain the status quo. Coercion, violence, and the threat of violence also played important roles. Events comparable to the peasant rebellions in China or the slave revolts in the Roman Empire did not happen in ancient India, or if they did, they are not documented. But political texts do express fears of social upheaval and rebellion. A great deal has changed over the centuries, but inequality is still a fact of life. Religion continues to offer a refuge, but there are many other institutions and instruments that seek to establish and affirm the principle of equality. Constitutional provisions, the enactment of progressive laws, and social and political activism and mobilization are some of the ways in which the problems and realities of social inequality have been addressed in recent times. But inequalities and prejudices, including those based on caste, still exist in India. So does the idea of and practice of untouchability, even though it is banned by law. Although caste is closely associated with Hinduism, its imprint can also be seen on religions that ostensibly have a more egalitarian social outlook. Every day, newspapers and news channels carry stories of brutal caste oppression and caste violence, and of honor killings where young people who dare to love across caste and religious boundaries are killed, usually by their own close kin. All around us, we see all too vividly how violence is woven into structures of inequality and oppression. Can we really believe it was different in times gone by? The second chapter of my book is about desire and detachment, and it is the chapter I enjoyed writing the most. I start with the Jogi Mara cave inscription, an ancient expression of love between Devadinna and Sutanuka, And I try to decode ancient love as it is represented and celebrated in inscriptions, texts, and art. We do not know what the average ancient Indian thought about love and sex. The approaches revealed in texts and art include celebration, denigration, sublimation, and transcendence. Ancient literature in Tamil, Prakrit, and Sanskrit is permeated with the sentiments of love and the excitement of passion. Technical treatises contain the calmer experts' analysis of pleasure. Ancient art, mainly found in religious spaces, celebrates the human body and the love of man and woman. Its representations range from subtle sensuality to the frankly erotic. Pleasure was recognized as a legitimate goal of human existence, to be pursued with a sense of balance and in harmony with the other goals such as dharma and artha, even moksha, perhaps. Extreme love was justified only when it formed a template for a higher love, love for God. The love between devotee and deity was visualized as reciprocal, intense, sublime, a path to a higher spiritual goal. Here, there was no possibility of excess. In tantric ritual, sex was divested of its association with desire or pleasure. These diverse perspectives, which attach different kinds of positive value to love, sex, and/or desire, coexisted with a very strong tradition that viewed all these, indeed the body itself, as sources of bondage and suffering. The control of sexual impulses and acts was central to several, though not all, ascetic systems, and it was a cornerstone of Jain and Buddhist monastic practice. One could be a good Jain or Buddhist by following the teachings laid down for the laity, but one could not attain liberation from samsara, that is the cycle of birth and death, without giving everything up and joining the monastic order. Liberation required transcending all forms of attachment and desire. Renunciation, the principle of renunciation, I think is a very important aspect of Indian culture, and it casts its shadow or light across the centuries and still inspires similar here today. Love has not gone out of fashion, but its representations have changed drastically compared to ancient times. Love and longing are favored themes in contemporary literature, art, folk tales, music, dance, film, and theater. Dating apps give the illusion that love is just a swipe away. However, the celebration of the amorous and the sensual is accompanied in the public domain, especially among the middle classes, by an extreme prudery when it comes to norms of social behavior, especially female behavior. The body, especially the female body, is considered a distraction to be covered and concealed from the male gaze. Sex, too, is to be discussed in a furtive manner or not at all, and has its proper place only within marriage. Love and pleasure are not usually connected with marriage, and if they are, they're supposed to follow, not precede it. These ideas and attitudes of our own time are very different from those reflected in a great deal of ancient literature and art. Chapter 3 of my book focuses on the apparent contradiction between the worship of goddesses and social structures in which women face many forms of subordination and oppression. Across the centuries, the idea of the feminine principle as embodying fertility, auspiciousness, and plenitude coexisted with the idea of women as having negative and destructive potential. In the religious sphere, although the central foci of veneration and religious authority remained male, female deities had a strong presence. The story of goddess worship in India is not one of submergence in male-dominated religion, but of increasing vibrancy and importance. Goddess culture formed a strong, continuing aspect of popular belief and practice, cutting across sectarian identities and divides. From the 19th century onwards, the nation too has been visualized as a goddess, Bharat Mata. Even today, apart from the female deities known from texts, goddesses of childbirth and disease are worshipped in villages across the length and breadth of the country to provide succor for everyday concerns and anxieties. However, goddess worship did not and does not translate into empowerment for real women. Within patriarchal social structures, women have always faced different degrees of subordination, depending on their class and caste and on the kinship structure. Many ancient texts indicate increasing efforts to control and confine women within the bounds of the family and the household. But the continuing attempts to control and discipline women, in fact, suggests that rules were not always followed and hence had to be hammered home century after century. The statements about the proper behavior of women and wives in many ancient texts sound depressingly familiar to attitudes prevailing in India today. But then, as now, there were women who did not conform and who dared to strike their own path. The ambivalence in ancient Indian texts towards women had multiple roots. Attitudes towards the woman's body, sexuality, and procreative potential, the patrilineal obsession with the production of sons, the need to control women's behavior in order to perpetuate the caste system, and the perception of female sexuality as posing a threat both to male celibacy and virile power. Male-dominated social and political systems offer certain spaces within which upper-class women can exercise their agency in various ways. But these spaces are very narrow for non-elite women whose experiences of subordination and oppression are qualitatively different and are largely undocumented in the sources of ancient times. Even today, in the countries of South Asia, although some women have managed to break through the glass ceiling and make it to the top of their professions, although there have been women presidents, prime ministers, and political leaders, gender equality is still a distant dream. The golden age for Indian women, I argue, does not lie in the past, but in the future. The fourth chapter of my book is about violence and non-violence, and it is a continuation of my earlier work on political violence, except I have extended the discussion in that earlier book. Very often in the popular domain, non-violence is equated with vegetarianism. The issue is much more complex. How do we define violence? Apart from violent actions, what about violent speech, thoughts, emotions, and intentions? What about the various forms and theaters of violence in the political, social, religious, and environmental spheres? What about public and private, visible and hidden violence? In all cases, the line between justified force and unjustified violence is difficult to draw and depends on perspective. Like inequality, violence too has always been a part of human history, although its forms, scale, and intensity have varied. The advent of the state ushered major changes in the structures for the perpetuation and control of violence. In my book, titled Political Violence in Ancient India, I documented and discussed how the increase of political violence was accompanied by increasingly sophisticated attempts to legitimize, invisibilize, and aestheticize it. Apart from warfare, certain forms of coercion and violence were and still are inherent in the state. Throughout history, states have been based on the systematic appropriation of economic and human resources from subjects. In ancient agrarian societies, rulers took a share of the farmer's grain in the form of taxes. Extracting taxes on a regular basis involved coercion and the threat or actual use of force. The harnessing of labor for state projects also involved coercion. Violence was also inherent in the interactions of ancient Indian states with forest people. The expansion of agriculture, cities, and states involved the steady clearance of forests, but the really massive forest clearance in the subcontinent took place in the middle of the 19th century as a result of population increase, commercial farming, and the expansion of railways. Till then, states lived cheek by jowl with forest tribes, extracting and controlling valuable economic and military resources like wood, ivory, and elephants, involved a steady encroachment on forest habitats and constant conflicts with forest people. The forest was an important object of the exploitation and violence of the state, but it was also a constant source of violent challenge to the state. The pejorative term mlecha in Sanskrit texts included tribals as well as foreigners and presented them as a threat to civilized people, so-called civilized people, I should say. But it could also be used to justify the violence against tribals and foreigners. Beyond the pervasiveness of warfare in ancient Indian political history, I have argued in this book that war was central to ancient Indian culture, as it was to many others. It is impossible to imagine the Sanskrit epics, the Mahabharata and the Ramayana, without war. The oldest Tamil literature, the Sangam poems, also reflect a warrior ethos in the Puram poems. In these and other texts, war forms a context in which many other important issues are discussed: human relationships, social duty, the goals of life, happiness, death and its aftermath, heaven and hell, and the relationship with the gods. While political theorists deliberated on the nature and conduct of war, poets, playwrights, royal biographers, and composers of royal inscriptions celebrated the military prowess and victories of kings. Through an elegant sleight of hand, they divested war of its ugliness and violence and presented it as something desirable, necessary, even beautiful. The upheavals of ancient Indian political history indicate that kings and dynasties were frequently challenged by rivals. Further evidence of threats of violence against the state comes from reading between the lines of texts, especially taking note of their expressions of worries and their insecurities and anxieties. And also, there are many references in text to kings and what happens to kings who do not discharge their duties properly. The Mahabharata discusses the king's duties and warns of the consequences of not performing them. According to this text, a just king goes to heaven, an unjust king goes to hell. In one place, the epic states that a cruel king, and I'm quoting, a cruel king who does not protect his people, who robs them in the name of levying taxes, is Kali incarnate and should be killed by his subjects. A king who, after declaring, I will protect you, does not protect them, should be killed by his people coming together as though he were a mad dog, unquote. There are several stories in ancient Indian texts of evil men who are also kings being killed. Duryodhan, Ravan, Kans are just some of the well-known ones. But the overall attitude of the Mahabharata, instead of all ancient Indian texts, is pro-government and pro-monarchy. Kinglessness is seen as the equivalent of anarchy. The most comprehensive and pragmatic discussion of violence against the state occurs in the Arthashastra. Kautilya advocates ruthless, carefully calculated, and effective use of preemptive and post facto violence by the state in order to prevent and respond to violence against the state. But Kautilya's king lives in constant fear of assassination, especially at the hands of his wives and sons. Kautilya advises the king to have an elaborate spy system and to deal firmly with revolts and conspiracies. Those who cannot be killed openly, he says, should be dealt with through silent punishment, upangshu danda, that is secret killing. Silent punishment, Kautilya says, can also be used against hostile subjects. There are many warnings in the Arthashastra about popular disaffection and prakriti kopa, meaning the anger or uprising of the people. These suggest an anxiety about the possibility of a mass rebellion of unhappy, dissatisfied subjects. While there are references to conflicts within elite groups, there are also a few inscriptional references to agrarian conflicts. But actually, the ancient Indian sources do not record a single historical instance of a large-scale popular rebellion against the state. Does this mean that ancient Indians were docile and obedient? never questioning the inequities and oppression of their rulers? There are other possible reasons. The concealment of such incidents by the sources, the effectiveness of the state's coercive and repressive machinery in preventing and crushing any resistance, and the absence of collective will, resources, and organization that would have enabled the victims of state oppression to come together and revolt against the state. Social conflict and violence were not absent in ancient India, but their presence has to be largely inferred from sources that are very good at muffling the voices of discontent or dissent. Such conflicts were often dealt with and diffused, though not entirely resolved, at the religious level before they boiled over. In my book, I have also examined the issue of gendered violence in ancient texts. Sanskrit Kavya presents an idyllic picture of a polygynous royal household with many women in the king's harem, many queens, mistresses, slaves, and servants, where women of varying rank and standing were available to kings for their pleasure and for the production of heirs. However, if the aesthetic veneer is peeled off and texts are read against the grain, the image of the happy harem dissolves into something ugly. Dharma Shastra, the Sanskrit epics, the Artha Shastra, and Kama Sutra provide some entry points to this alternative view. Of the 8 types of marriage listed in Dharma Shastra texts, 2, the Rakshasa and Paishacha, involve violence. The Rakshasa or demonic type of marriage is defined in the Manusmriti as, quote, when someone violently abducts a girl from her house as she is shrieking and weeping by causing death, mayhem, and destruction, unquote. The Paishacha marriage, which was considered the most evil, is when someone secretly rapes a woman who is sleeping, drunk, or deranged in mind. The reference to womanizing, Stri Vyasana, in the standard list of the king's vices in Sanskrit political texts recognizes the propensity of kings for sexual indulgence, which was considered all right in moderate doses, but problematic when it became excessive. There are several episodes of violence against women in the political domain in the Mahabharata and Ramayana. In the Ramayana, Ravan uses brute force while abducting Sita. In the Mahabharata, Dushasana violently drags Draupadi by the hair into the assembly hall and attempts to disrobe her publicly. Clearly, the epic's composers did not approve of such behavior, but the fact that these incidents are described in graphic detail and form extremely important parts of the epic narratives suggests a recognition of sexual violence against women as a feature of the political domain. The Kama Sutra has an entire section on the sex life of powerful men, which focuses especially on kings. Vatsyayan recommends strategies that these men can use to ensnare other men's wives. He recommends certain secret methods involving subterfuge as well as force, which he says are generally used by princes and kings. It should be clear that texts of different genres discuss the use of force against women, especially by politically powerful men. In some cases, this was considered as legitimate force, in other cases as illegitimate violence. In my discussion of violence and non-violence and the tension between these two principles in ancient India, I discuss the pragmatic and moral approaches represented by the Mauryan king Ashoka and the political theorist Kautilya. By the early century CE, although there was a broad cultural consensus on the positive value to be attached to non-violence, the specific views varied considerably in their grounding and emphasis. This emerges clearly from a comparison of 2 figures who are often considered opposites, Ashoka and Kautilya. The Maurya Emperor Ashoka has rightfully earned the reputation of being a remarkable king who renounced war and devoted his life to a vigorous project to make people follow Dhamma, which included non-violence. Kautilya, on the other hand, was a proponent of realpolitik, for whom the ends justified the means, and the ruthless pursuit of power justified deceit and killing. Therefore, it comes as a bit of a surprise that there are several similarities in their ideas. Both Ashoka and Kautilya associate kingship with benevolent paternalism, ensuring the welfare and happiness of all beings in this world and helping them attain heaven in the next. In Ashoka's Dhamma, the appropriate conduct towards all living beings is one of compassion, gentleness, and abstention from injuring and killing. The Arthashastra acknowledges the ethics applicable to everyone, which includes non-violence, ahimsa, truthfulness, purity, freedom from malice, non-cruelty, anrishamsya, and forbearance. While Ashoka's concern for animals is well known, Kautilya's is not. The Arthashastra lays down punishments for causing injury to humans, animals, and plants. It refers to animal sanctuaries, abhayavanas. Both Ashoka and Kautilya extend the application of the principle of non-injury to animals and expand it to include measures for animal welfare. However, there is a big difference in rationale and emphasis. Ashoka's commitment to non-violence was rooted in his reflections on the problem of violence and his faith in the Buddha's teaching. Kautilya's valorization of non-violence may sound hypocritical, considering the numerous places where he advocates ruthless actions involving injuring and killing human beings. But Kautilya was not a votary of unrestrained state violence. He sanctions all measures that are necessary for the king to maintain and enhance his political power. While there are occasional glimmers of compassion that extend beyond the utilitarian frame, Kautilya's general perspective is a pragmatic one, where the chief aim is maximizing economic gain from animals, especially for the state. Ensuring their welfare is essential for this. So although both Ashoka and Kautilya talk about the protection of animals, they do so from very different points of view. And of course, there are many other differences between Ashoka and Kautilya. For instance, in their attitude towards war. In Ashoka's Rock Edict 13, there is a remarkable reflection on the consequences of war. We see the king announcing that he has given up military victory for Dhamma Vijaya, that is victory through Dhamma, which consists of propagating Dhamma within and beyond the frontiers of his empire. And what you have in the 13th Rock Edict is a very, very interesting and thought-provoking critique, not only a kind of reflection on the Kalinga War, but a very serious critique of war in general, and an explanation coming from an ancient Indian emperor about why war is a bad thing. For Kautilya, on the other hand, war was a normal part of political life. And although the Arthashastra talks about the Dharma Vijayi, that is the righteous victor, Kautilya's understanding of the Dharma Vijayan is one who is satisfied with mere submission. Kautilya's idea of dharmic victory or the dharmic victor is very different from Ashoka's idea of Dhamma Vijaya, because Ashoka's idea of Dhamma Vijaya is not military victory at all. It consists of the propagation of virtue and goodness. It is not easy to define violence, nor is it easy to draw a line between justified and unjustified force. Where that line is drawn depends on perspective. Vegetarianism was by no means the norm in ancient India, but the issue of violence goes far beyond dietary habits. India's ancient history, like the history of other parts of the world, is replete with violence of various kinds. War is the best documented, but other forms of political and social violence can be identified or inferred. The intellectual reactions to violence included moral, political, and aesthetic ones. Attitudes towards the violence of the state, including war, were fairly pragmatic, even in the religions of nonviolence. All ancient Indian textual traditions distinguish force that is necessary, proportionate, and legitimate from force which is unnecessary, excessive, and illegitimate, thereby leaving open a window for questioning the state's tyranny and coercive power. Were ancient Indians non-violent? No. Were they less violent than people living in other parts of the world? To answer this question, we need a comparative global history of violence, which we do not have at present. But one thing is certain: ancient Indian intellectuals, political theorists, philosophers, and religious leaders discussed the tension between violence and non-violence more intensely than anywhere else in the world. How is the amnesia about violence in ancient Indian history to be explained? It comes from an idealized interpretation of Indian history. It comes from a hop, skip, and jump approach that magically connects Mahavir, the Buddha, Ashoka, and Gandhi, and leaves out everything that comes in between. It comes from the centrality of non-violence in the Indian freedom struggle. Gandhian nationalism contributed in a big way towards creating the illusion that non-violence was somehow ingrained in the Indian psyche. But even Gandhi, the modern icon of non-violence, struggled throughout his life with the problem of violence, and he met his end through an assassin's bullet. Non-violence acquires its deepest meaning in the midst of intense violence. In the 5th chapter of my book, I discuss philosophical and religious debate and conflict. In communally charged times, such as those that we live in today, hurting religious sentiments is an allegation that flies all too easily. Apart from writers, artists, and filmmakers, historians too often find themselves in the bad books of religious orthodoxies. The charges that are usually made are based on ideas of monolithic, antagonistic religious identities. How have these ideas come to dominate? And how is it that in spite of the communal prejudice and conflict we see around us today, Indians persist in thinking of themselves as a tolerant people? The word tolerance can include a wide range of attitudes, including indifference, superficial engagement, genuine dialogue, and concord. I think this word makes sense in a monotheistic context, especially in cultures where there was a close relationship between the state and church. And it's an idea. The idea of tolerance, I think, is a bit out of place in the Indian context, especially the ancient Indian context. So rather than talking about tolerance and intolerance, in my book, I've examined issues such as philosophical dialogue and debate, classifications of philosophical schools, and the divide between people referred to as Astika and Nastika. I've discussed the hagiographies, that is the sacred biographies of saints and religious leaders, royal religious policy, the relationship between Hinduism and Buddhism, Jainism and Shaivism, and I've also discussed religious satire, which we see, for instance, in the writings of Kshaimendra. Ancient India had a long and lively tradition of philosophical dialogue and debate on issues such as dharma, the nature of reality and existence, ethics, and the path to liberation from samsara. Debates were usually games of one-upmanship to demonstrate mastery and superiority over other ideas or systems of thoughts. But they nevertheless show the existence of a spirit of vigorous thinking and questioning among intellectuals. In fact, the growth of knowledge, any kind of knowledge, is not possible without such thinking and questioning and debate. The crystallization and consolidation of religious religious identities in ancient and early medieval India involved give and take, competition, critique, and polemic. The existence of many multi-religious sites across India in ancient context does not necessarily reflect a situation of religious harmony or peaceful coexistence. While texts, especially the sacred biographies of saints, give a picture of sharply defined boundaries, actual religious practice reveals shared elements and a picture that is much more syncretic, hybrid, and fluid. At the political level, although there were some episodes of violent religious persecution by kings in ancient times, the more usual policy was one of multi-directional religious patronage, with the patronage of Brahmins forming a constant. This pragmatic response to a very variegated, diverse religious landscape led to a certain level of hybridity that became part of the culture of royal courts and must have permeated into the larger social sphere. In more recent times, with increasingly monolithic and antagonistic understandings of religious identity, tensions between religious communities exist in a heightened state, ever ready to explode. Communal riots have become all too frequent. Shrill diatribe prevails over genuine dialogue, which does not, in fact, really seem to exist at all. The conflicts have been most intense in the context of the control of religious sites. For instance, Shaivs versus Buddhists at Bodh Gaya, Digambars versus Shwetambaras at Sammed Shikhar, and Hindus versus Muslims in the decades-long Ram Janmabhoomi Babri Masjid dispute at Ayodhya. The last of these reached a legal conclusion after many decades of litigation and a great deal of tragic violence. In ancient India, there were multiple religious communities, but no state religion. Perhaps there is a lesson here for our own times. In the last 10 minutes or so, I would like to focus on some of the conclusions that I reach in my book. So I'm talking now about more general issues, especially those that arise when we look at ancient India from a modern, contemporary standpoint. In my view, many distorted views of the past emerge from presentism. What do I mean by presentism? I mean judging and using the past to serve the agendas of the present. The image of ancient India as a utopia of social and religious harmony and non-violence is a false one. So is its image as a dystopia marked only by inequity, conflict, and violence. Beyond glorification and denigration, there is the possibility of trying to understand how the multiple threads of the past are intertwined with each other, not only in terms of facticity, but also of ambiguity, contrast, tension, and contradiction. While discussing the different aspects of ancient Indian cultural traditions, the conjunction or is best replaced by and. As I've shown in my book, there is evidence in ancient India of both inequality as well as promises of universal salvation. There is a valorization of desire and a valorization of detachment. We see goddess worship and misogyny, violence and non-violence, religious dialogue and conflict. Just as extraordinary as the range of contradictions is the fact that they seem rather familiar to us today. The reason is that in spite of the passage of centuries, the enormous changes and upheavals of history, somehow these contradictions still live on. Many of the texts, ideas, and symbols I have discussed in my book also live on in the form of appropriations, recastings, and sometimes reversals. The adoption of the Sarnath capital of Ashoka as an emblem of the Indian nation state at the time of independence reflected the Nehruvian understanding of Ashoka as a representative of the positive values of peace, harmony, and cosmopolitanism. The ancient texts, Ramayana and Mahabharata, in many different languages and in many different forms, are well known, much loved, and influential across India and parts of Southeast Asia in various oral, written, and performative tellings. While the Ramayana tradition usually sees Ram as an exemplar of virtues, in Periyar's writings, he is seen as a symbol of northern Aryan tyranny. Duryodhan is a villain in the Sanskrit Mahabharata, but there are temples dedicated to him in Jakhol village in Himachal Pradesh and Malanad village in Kerala. Kautilya too lives on under the more popular name of Chanakya in corporate self-help books and on a recently issued 5 rupee coin commemorating 150 years of the Indian Income Tax Department. In sharp contrast to the Puranic stories of Durga Mahishasura Mardini, in Dalit counter-narratives, the demon Mahishasura is an heroic figure representing oppressed indigenous people and lower castes. Such reversals seem less surprising when we consider that they are part of a very long-standing tradition of interpretation, reinterpretation, and counter-narratives. The ancient past, more so, or especially the epic past, has inspired innumerable modern Indian writers, artists, and filmmakers. I have referred in my book to the work of some of my favorite artists. If we choose to seek inspiration from the ancient past, there's a large menu from which to choose. However, I think it is somewhat ironical that people living in a modern democracy should make appeals, sometimes of very different kinds, to traditions that were rooted in hierarchical and unequal societies governed by autocratic kings. These appeals are usually based on a very selective reading and decontextualizing of the evidence. As I mentioned right at the outset, ancient societies accepted the idea of the natural inequality of social groups. This is the antithesis of the principle of natural equality, which is a fundamental premise of modern democracy. The principles of liberty and equality first made their appearance in Indian history with the promulgation of the Constitution of the Indian Republic. The inspiration for a better future, in my view, should come not from a past that is long gone, but from aspirations for a future that is yet to come, one which we can only hope will be better than the past or the present. I'm saying this because in the present context of an increasingly authoritarian and intolerant state, it has become fashionable to talk about the ancient Indian tradition of debate and dissent, and to present debate and dissent as inherent aspects of ancient Indian culture and civilization. Questioning and debate there was, but we should not forget that in the unequal, hierarchical societies of ancient times, debate and questioning were luxuries that were often limited to small elite groups. If we must extract some takeaways for our times from ancient India, it is better, I think, to choose some of the elements of the model of an ideal ruler that the ancient texts talk about. That a ruler must be utterly impartial in the administration of justice, must not be motivated by considerations of personal favor or profit, and should not be swayed by a lust for power. This ideal, and there is this ideal of the Rajarshi, the sage-like king, this is as valid in discussions of ancient monarchies as it is in modern democracies. In fact, I think that Kautilya's warning of cruel and unjust rulers meeting their nemesis due to prakriti kopa, that is anger of the people, suits modern democracies better than ancient monarchies. Thank you very much for having the patience, for listening to my discussion of my latest book, Ancient India, Culture of Contradictions. I hope you found something that was of interest here. And then let me end by thanking Veerayya Konduri and the Manamanchi Pustakam group for inviting me to share some of my thoughts about how ancient Indian culture can be thought about in terms of the existence of certain tensions and contradictions, and how we can connect some of these tensions and contradictions with things that we see around us even today. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, ma'am. Before winding up the session, let me have one question and try to draw your attention. I think you need to spend some more time, at least 5 minutes more, on the state of no religious state in ancient India, because you referred to several inscriptions, Karavela, Kalhana, Rajtarangani, and Pushmitra Sringa, how they dealt about their religion, they proscribed, or the religion of the people. So that would be more appropriate to this context. So please.
Sure. So I've talked about in the book, I've talked about how there was no state religion in ancient India. You know, even in the time of Ashoka, Ashoka is known to have been an ardent Buddhist. We know that from not only Buddhist texts, but also from his own inscriptions, where he declares his deep faith in the Buddha, the Dhamma, and the Sangha. But the Dhamma that Ashoka talks about in his inscriptions so passionately, the Dhamma that he tried to inculcate among his people, is really something that is more of an ethical code, which derived inspiration from Buddhism, but was not identical to Buddhism. I would see Ashoka's Dhamma as, I think we can translate it as goodness or virtue. So he did not try to, Ashoka did not try to create a Buddhist state, okay? And similarly, when we look at later centuries, of course, we know from texts and we also know from inscriptions about the personal religious affiliations of particular kings. But when you look at the inscriptions, particularly donative inscriptions, royal donative inscriptions, you find very often that a king who is, let's say, a sheikh, is making donations to other religious denominations, or a king who has Jain leanings may be making gifts to Brahmins. And you see a kind of, what shall I say, a distribution of religious patronage to a variety of religious groups. So the people or the religious groups who benefited from a king's the kind of patronage that he gave in terms of financial support, whether in the form of land or money or whatever, patronage was not restricted to the personal religious beliefs of a king. So, you know, this is a larger pattern. And I feel that there's something to learn from this. I think it's a very pragmatic attitude. That is, if you are a ruler over in a kingdom or in a state where there are many religious groups, it actually makes a lot of practical, pragmatic sense, you know, not to be exclusive in the way in which you deal with them, and not to be exclusive or partial in terms of your patronage. So I think there is something here that perhaps we can learn from in our own time, since we live in a multi-religious kind of country where we would like to see more religious harmony than there is currently.
That is why we need to go back to the ancient, to read and know about the ancient history, literally what had happened. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much. And for those who are interested in history, let me read out some of your titles so that they may feel to go through once again. The books written by Professor Upendra Singh, Political Violence in Ancient India, published in 2017. Portraits of Power, Idea of Ancient India, Essays in Religion, Politics and Archaeology, The History of Ancient India and Medieval India from the Stone Age to 12th Century, Discovery of Ancient India, Early Archaeologies and Beginnings of Archaeology, Mysteries of Past, Archaeological Sites in India. That's what basically addressed to children. Ancient Delhi, Kings, Brahmins and Temples in Odisha. Epigraphic Study, that is 300 to 1117. About 800 years span she covered in that book. That was published perhaps initial stages of your career, 1990.
That's my PhD thesis, till 1147. Yes, that was based on my PhD
thesis. And also she edited about 10 books. Hopefully they are more interested and like this one. And I do hope I can contact her back after selecting some titles so that there can be a seamless understanding of your way of reading, looking at the history, so that there can be interconnectedness in the understanding. Thank you, ma'am. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Viraya. Thank you so much. Bye.
Thank you.